The autumn morning arrived over Thornvale village the way it always did, cold and indifferent to the struggles of those who lived at the edge of forgotten territory. Mist clung to the valley floor like an unwelcome guest, obscuring the crooked paths between houses that leaned against each other in weary companionship. This was a place where hope came in small portions and survival demanded everything a person had to give. In the healer's cottage at the village center, Elara Nightingale worked by candlelight, her hands moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned her trade through necessity rather than formal training. The young militia volunteer on her table gritted his teeth against the pain as she extracted the arrow shaft from his shoulder, her touch gentle despite the brutality of the task. The wound was clean, thank the old gods. Border Patrol skirmishes rarely left clean wounds. She packed the injury with a poultice made from winter bloom and silverleaf, herbs she had gathered herself from the dangerous spaces where civilized territory met the wild places beyond. The boy, he could not have been more than 19, watched her work with eyes that held too much knowledge for his age. War did that to young men. It stripped away their youth and replaced it with understanding no one should have to carry. When she finished binding the wound, Elara met his gaze and saw the question forming before he spoke it. She had heard it before, in different words from different mouths, always carrying the same underlying confusion. "Why do you stay here?" The boy's voice was rough from holding back his pain during the extraction. "You're good enough for the Royal Hospital in Ironspire. Better than good. My brother trains there. He says they'd take you in a heartbeat." Elara cleaned her instruments with practiced motions, buying herself a moment before answering. The question always caught her between pride and shame, between the calling she felt and the limitations everyone could see. She was an Omega, the weakest classification in their hierarchical world. Her wolf spirit was so faint that even other Omegas sometimes forgot she was there. At 23 years old, by every measure their society valued, she was insignificant. But her hands knew how to stop bleeding. Her mind understood which herbs could draw infection from wounds and which could ease the suffering of those beyond saving. She had skills that mattered, even if she lacked the strength that their kind prized above all else. "Someone has to stay for those who can't leave," she said finally, the words coming out exactly as her father had taught her all those years ago. That's what duty means, not the glory, just showing up when everyone else has reasons to walk away. The boy nodded as if he understood, though at 19 he probably did not. Not yet. Understanding that particular truth required years of watching people make the other choice, years of being the one left behind when stronger wolves sought their fortunes elsewhere. Her father had understood. He had been a soldier once, before the war that never quite ended broke his body and sent him home to die slowly in this forgotten place. He had taught her about wounds and medicine because he needed someone to tend his injuries, but he had taught her about duty because he knew she would need armor against the world's casual cruelty. As the boy left, testing his newly bound shoulder with careful movements, Elara allowed herself a moment of stillness in the cottage that had been her entire world for 23 years. Morning light was beginning to burn through the mist outside, revealing the village in all its stubborn poverty. Thornvale had perhaps 200 souls, most of them too old or too damaged or too weak to find acceptance in the prosperous territories. They survived on subsistence farming and what little trade passed through on the way to somewhere more important. They survived because people like Elara made survival possible through small mercies and careful stewardship of meager resources. Her mentor, healer Miriam Stonefield, arrived as the sun cleared the eastern ridge. The older woman moved with the careful precision of someone whose joints complained about cold mornings, but her eyes remained sharp as broken glass. She had been an army medic 40 years ago, before politics and gender had combined to push her out of service. Everything Elara knew about field medicine she had learned from Miriam. Everything she knew about surviving in a world that did not value women like them, she had learned from watching the old healer endure. Border Patrol brought in 3 more this week, Miriam said without preamble, settling into the chair by the cold hearth. This is the 5th week running. Someone's pushing the boundaries, testing our response times. Alara set water to boil for the bitter tea Miriam favored. Northern Coalition? Who else? Miriam accepted the cup when it came, warming her hands against the clay. They smell weakness the way wolves smell blood. King's been too cautious since the disaster 2 years back. Everyone knows it. Everyone's waiting to see if he'll break or if someone else will break him first. The disaster. Everyone in the territories knew the story, though few spoke of it directly. Commander Cale Stormwright, the Alpha King himself, had led 200 men into what was supposed to be a minor border action. An ambush had turned it into a slaughter. Only half the men came back, and those who did carried wounds that went deeper than flesh. The king had survived, but something in him had changed. The aggressive defense that had kept the territories secure for years had become a hesitant caution that emboldened enemies and frustrated allies. Alara had never seen the king. Men like that existed in a different world, one where power and politics determined the course of lives. Her world was smaller, bounded by the distance she could walk in a day and the number of people she could help before exhaustion claimed her. But she understood survivor's guilt. She had watched it destroy her father over the course of 5 slow years, eating him alive from the inside while his war wounds consumed his body. "The king will find his strength again," Alara said, surprising herself with the conviction in her voice. "Or he won't. Either way, we keep doing what we do. People here need care. That doesn't change based on politics." Miriam smiled, and it was the sad smile of someone recognizing their own words coming back to them through a younger voice. "Your father would be proud of who you've become." The words settled over Alara like a blessing and a burden. Her father had died believing she would do something meaningful with her life, believing that weakness of body did not equal weakness of spirit. Most days she felt she was honoring that faith. Some days she felt like a fraud playing at significance in a backwater no one would remember. The conversation turned to inventory and supply needs, the practical matters that kept a healing practice running in a place without resources. They needed more winter bloom for infection treatment. The silverleaf stocks were running low. Someone would need to venture to the territorial border where the old stones marked the boundary between Crimson Ridge territory and the unclaimed lands beyond. It was dangerous work, but necessary. It was always necessary. "I'll go tomorrow," Alara said. "The morning patrols will be along the northern route. Southern border should be quiet." Miriam studied her with those sharp eyes that missed nothing. "You know the risks. I know the needs." Alara met her mentor's gaze steadily. "We can't help people without supplies. Someone has to gather them." After Miriam left, Alara prepared for the next day's expedition. She checked her gathering bag, making sure the leather was sound and the carrying straps would not fail under weight. She sharpened the small knife she carried for cutting roots and stems. She reviewed the mental map she had built over years of careful observation, marking in her mind the safest paths through dangerous territory. This was her other skill, the one that made her useful beyond her healing knowledge. Alara Nightingale had a gift for understanding terrain and remembering paths. She could walk through a forest once and recall every landmark, every fork in the trail, every source of water or shelter. It was not the kind of skill that commanded respect or admiration. It was simply practical, useful in the same way a good knife was useful. But it kept her alive in places that killed careless travelers. That night she dreamed of her father. He stood at the edge of a dark forest, his face peaceful in a way it never had been during his final years. He did not speak, but his presence conveyed approval, and that was enough. When she woke in the deep hours before dawn on what she thought would be an ordinary autumn morning, Alara felt steady, ready. Whatever the day brought, she would face it the way he had taught her to face everything, one step at a time, with clear eyes and a steady hand. Hey. On that same morning, Commander K.L. Stormwright stood 50 miles to the north in the map room of a forward military outpost, trying to ignore the weight pressing down on his chest. At 39 years old, he had spent more than half his life in command, first as a young lieutenant at 21, then inheriting the throne at 22 when his father fell in a border skirmish. The tactical displays showed Northern Coalition movements along the border, subtle repositioning that could mean nothing or could mean everything. His officers waited for orders that he could not quite bring himself to give. Captain Dane Blackwater cleared his throat carefully, the sound of a subordinate trying to prompt his commander without overstepping. "Sir, if they're massing for a push, we need to reinforce the eastern garrison. The window for safe troop movement closes in 3 days. K.L. studied the map without really seeing it. 3 days. Always a deadline. Always a decision that could cost lives if he chose wrong. 2 years ago he had chosen wrong, and 200 families had received notifications that their sons, brothers, fathers would not be coming home. 200 funerals he had attended, each one a fresh reminder that command meant killing the men you swore to protect. "Hold position," he said finally, and heard the frustration in Dane's silence. Hold position. Wait and watch. The cautious choice, the safe choice, the choice that let enemies grow bolder while allies grew restless. When the briefing ended and the officers filed out, one man remained behind. Marcus Thornfield, called Old Bear by 3 generations of soldiers he had trained, settled into the chair across from K.L. with the ease of someone who had earned the right to ignore protocol. At 62, Marcus should have retired years ago, but he claimed retirement was for men who had nothing left to teach. The truth, which both men knew but did not speak, was that Marcus stayed because K.L. needed him. "You're in your head again." Marcus's voice carried the rough affection of a father speaking to a son, replaying the ambush, counting the dead. K.L. did not bother denying it. "Every decision I make is filtered through that day. I see threats everywhere. I second-guess every tactical assessment. This is not how a king should lead. This is how a man who cares about his soldiers leads." Marcus leaned forward, elbows on his knees, meeting K.L.'s eyes with steady understanding. "You think those 200 men would have followed you if you didn't carry their deaths? You think the army trusts you because you're perfect? They trust you because you bleed when they bleed. That's worth more than tactical brilliance. It's not worth more than their lives." The words came out harder than K.L. intended. "I got 200 men killed because I trusted the wrong intelligence, because I was arrogant enough to think I could outmaneuver an enemy I did not fully understand. That's not the foundation of trust. That's the definition of failure." Marcus sat back, his weathered face settling into lines carved by decades of hard truths. "You want to know what failure looks like? Failure is refusing to learn from your mistakes. Failure is letting guilt turn you into someone who can't protect anyone because he's too afraid of making another wrong choice. You've been failing for 2 years, K.L. Not because you lost men, because you won't forgive yourself for being human." The words landed like physical blows, and K.L. felt something crack inside his careful control. His wolf spirit, silent for so long he sometimes forgot it was there, stirred in the darkness of his mind. The sensation was painful, like frozen limbs coming back to feeling after too long in the cold. His wolf had gone quiet the day he stood over 200 fresh graves, and accepted that he had led good men to pointless deaths. Without his wolf's presence, he was incomplete, strong enough to function, but hollow in ways that no amount of discipline could fill. "I can't hear him anymore," K.L. said quietly, and the admission felt like pulling a blade from an old wound. "My wolf. He's there, I can sense him, but he won't speak, won't respond. It's like he's punishing both of us for what I did." Marcus's expression softened with understanding. "Wolves are spiritual creatures. They feel what we feel. Yours is carrying the same guilt you carry. Maybe he'll speak again when you're ready to forgive. I'm not ready. The truth tasted bitter. I don't know if I'll ever be ready. Then you'll keep walking this path until it breaks you, or until you find a reason to step off it. Marcus stood, placing a hand on Kyle shoulder with the easy intimacy of long friendship. The peace talks tomorrow. They're a chance to prevent more deaths. Focus on that. Let the past be past, just for a few hours. After Marcus left, Kyle remained in the map room, staring at symbols that represented living men who trusted him with their survival. The Northern Coalition wanted negotiations, a formal discussion of border disputes and trade routes. It could be genuine diplomacy, or it could be theater designed to mask military preparations. Either way, Kyle had to attend. A king could not send subordinates to peace talks. He had to stand before his enemies and his allies alike and pretend he was whole. The route to the negotiation site was a careful secret, known only to his most trusted officers. Kyle, Captain Dane, Marcus, and 9 hand-picked soldiers would travel light and fast, arriving at the neutral ground with minimal fanfare. It was a calculated risk, but all of leadership was calculated risk. Sometimes you chose correctly. Sometimes 200 men died. That night Kyle did not sleep. He stood at the window of his quarters, looking out over the camp where soldiers prepared for duties they might not survive. He thought about the men he had lost, and the men he was responsible for protecting. He thought about the weight of a crown that felt more like a collar with each passing year. Somewhere in the darkness of his mind, his wolf spirit stirred again, briefly, before settling back into its punishing silence. Tomorrow he would ride to peace talks that might end in treachery. He would make decisions that could cost lives. He would carry the burden of command, because that was what kings did. They carried the weight until it crushed them, or until they found the strength to bear it. Kyle Stormwright did not know which ending awaited him. He only knew he was too tired to care. Hey, the ambush came exactly where good tactics said it should, in the narrow valley where the road passed between steep ridges covered in dense forest. Kyle saw the kill zone the moment they entered it, and knew with sick certainty that this was no peace negotiation. This was an execution dressed up as diplomacy. The first volley of arrows came from both ridges simultaneously, a coordinated strike that spoke of professional soldiers rather than opportunistic bandits. Silver-tipped arrows, expensive and deadly to werewolves, fell like rain designed to kill rather than wound. Kyle's escort reacted with the trained precision of men who had survived worse, forming a defensive circle around their king even as the second volley found its marks. 2 soldiers went down in the opening seconds, silver poisoning spreading through their bloodstreams before they could shift to their more resilient wolf forms. Captain Dane took an arrow through his thigh and kept fighting, his sword finding enemies who thought wounded meant helpless. Marcus, Old Bear. Marcus, who should have been safe in retirement, positioned himself directly behind Kyle and started calling tactical adjustments in the calm voice he had used to train 3 generations of warriors. The ambush was too precise. The enemy knew their route, their timing, the exact composition of their escort. This was not military intelligence. This was betrayal from someone inside Kyle's inner circle, someone who had traded lives for whatever the Northern Coalition offered. Kyle fought with the cold efficiency of someone who had spent 30 years learning to kill. His sword found throats and hearts with mechanical precision. His wolf spirit, silent for 2 years, suddenly surged to the surface in response to mortal danger. For the first time since the disaster, Kyle felt the power of his full nature coursing through his body. It was exhilarating and terrifying, and completely inadequate against the coordinated assault designed specifically to kill him. "Break north!" Marcus's voice cut through the chaos. "Into the forest! They can't maintain formation in the trees!" It was the right call, the tactical choice that gave them the best chance of survival. Kyle trusted Marcus's judgment more than his own, especially now when grief and rage clouded his thinking. He gave the order, and his surviving soldiers fought their way toward the forest edge, leaving bodies behind because there was no time for retrieval, no time for anything except survival. That was when Kale saw the archer on the north ridge, bow drawn and aimed not at him, but at Marcus. The old soldier's back was exposed as he directed the retreat, his attention focused on saving his men rather than protecting himself. Kyle saw the shot coming, saw the silver-tipped arrow that would punch through Marcus's spine and drop him in the kill zone where he would die alone while his brothers ran for safety. The decision was instinct, not thought. Kyle threw himself sideways, placing his body between Marcus and the arrow. The impact hit him like a hammer blow, punching through the gap in his armor and burying itself deep in his side. Silver poison flooded his system immediately, burning through his veins like liquid fire. His wolf, so newly awakened, screamed in agony and retreated back into silence. "Kale!" Marcus spun, saw him falling, saw the arrow jutting from his side. The old soldier's face transformed from tactical assessment to raw anguish in the space between heartbeats. "Get them out!" Kale forced the words through teeth clenched against pain. "That's an order, Sergeant." 3 more arrows hit him before Marcus could respond. One through his shoulder, one through his thigh, one grazing his neck and leaving a burning line of silver poisoning. Kyle went down hard, his body already shutting down from the toxin spreading through his bloodstream. Around him, his soldiers fought with desperate fury, trying to create space for a rescue that tactical reality made impossible. Marcus knelt beside him, hands hovering over wounds he could not treat, eyes reflecting the knowledge that his king was dying. "I'm not leaving you." "You are." Kyle grabbed Marcus's arm with failing strength. "You're getting these men to safety. You're living to train the next generation. You're doing your duty, old bear." "My duty is to you." Marcus's voice cracked, decades of discipline shattering against the reality of watching his son in all but blood bleed out on foreign soil. "Your duty is to the living." Kale felt darkness creeping into the edges of his vision. "I'm already dead, brother. Don't join me, please. Don't make my last order when you refuse." Captain Dane appeared beside Marcus, his own wounds bleeding freely, but his determination absolute. "Sir, enemy closing from 3 sides. We have maybe 30 seconds. Marcus looked at Kyle, then at the soldiers waiting for orders, then back at Kyle. The choice was written in his eyes, the impossible decision between the man he loved like a son and the duty he had served for 40 years. When he stood, leaving Kyle on the blood-soaked ground, his face aged 20 years in that single movement. "I'll come back for you." The words were a promise and a prayer. "I swear it. I'll come back. I know you will." Kyle tried to smile and managed only a grimace. "That's why I'm ordering you not to. Live, old bear. That's all I ask. Live and remember me." Marcus drew his sword, positioned himself between Kyle and the advancing enemy, and spoke his final words to the king he had served since that king was a boy learning to hold a practice blade. "You were the best of us, Kale Stormwright. The absolute best." Then he raised his voice to battlefield volume and bellowed the order that would haunt him for whatever time he had left. "Fighting retreat to the forest. Move now." The soldiers obeyed because discipline was stronger than emotion, because Marcus was right and staying meant dying for nothing. They formed a moving defensive line, cutting down enemies who pressed too close, creating the space Marcus needed to cover their escape. The old soldier held the center position, his sword a silver blur of deadly precision honed over 4 decades of combat. An enemy soldier got through the line, blade aimed at Captain Dane's exposed back. Marcus intercepted the strike, his own blade taking the man's head before the threat could materialize. But the maneuver left him open, and 3 arrows found him in the span of a single heartbeat. Silver arrows, because the enemy knew to use silver against wolves. Marcus staggered, remained upright through sheer will, and kept fighting. "Go!" He roared at his soldiers, at Dane who hesitated between duty and loyalty. "Go now! That's an order!" They went. They had to. Staying would make their sergeant's sacrifice meaningless, and veterans understood that some sacrifices demanded honor through survival rather than through shared death. The soldiers melted into the forest, pursued but not caught, wounded but alive. Marcus stood alone in the kill zone, bleeding from multiple wounds, his strength failing, but his purpose absolute. He had maybe 30 seconds before the silver poison reached his heart. He used that time to turn back to where Kyle lay motionless on the ground, to take 3 steps toward his king before his legs gave out and he fell to his knees. "I failed you." The words came out as a whisper, meant only for Kyle, who was probably already beyond hearing. "I'm sorry, son. I'm so sorry." The last thing Marcus Thornfield saw before darkness claimed him was enemy soldiers surrounding Kyle's body, checking for signs of life. The last thing he heard was their commander declaring the Alpha King dead. The last thought that crossed his dying mind was gratitude that Kyle would not have to carry the guilt of another man's death. Sometimes mercy came disguised as tragedy. Marcus died believing his sacrifice had bought his soldiers their escape. He died believing Kyle was already gone, beyond pain and suffering. He died without knowing that his final act of loyalty had given the king he loved just enough time for his wolf spirit to surge one last time, to channel everything remaining into a desperate transformation that let Kyle crawl from the kill zone while the enemy was distracted by Marcus's last stand. Kyle made it perhaps half a mile before his body gave out completely. He collapsed in a hollow beneath an ancient oak, his wolf form bleeding from a dozen silver wounds, his consciousness fading in and out like a candle flame in high wind. Around him, the forest watched with the indifference of something older than kingdoms and more patient than death. His last coherent thought before darkness swallowed him was of Marcus, and the old soldier's words echoing through his failing mind. "You were the best of us, the absolute best." Then there was nothing but pain and silence, and the slow approach of death. Elara found him 3 hours later, guided by instinct she could not explain, and signs only she was trained to notice. The forest floor showed disturbances that others would miss, scuff marks and broken branches that spoke of something large passing through in great pain. She followed the trail the way she had learned to follow wounded animals, with patience and care, and the grim knowledge that what she found might already be beyond saving. The wolf lay in the hollow like a fallen king, his massive frame too large for any normal member of their kind. Silver arrows protruded from his body at angles that should have meant immediate death. His breathing was shallow and irregular, each inhalation a visible struggle against the poison working through his system. Blood matted his dark fur, and even in unconsciousness his face bore an expression of such profound anguish that Elara's heart clenched in involuntary sympathy. She knelt beside him slowly, careful not to make sudden movements that might trigger defensive instincts. This close she could smell the silver poisoning, a scent like burning metal that made her weak wolf spirit whimper in sympathetic pain. She could also sense his wolf, that magnificent spirit that should have been roaring with the strength of an alpha, but instead flickered like a candle about to gutter out. Elara's medical training took over, pushing aside fear and doubt in favor of systematic assessment. Multiple penetrating wounds with silver contamination, massive blood loss, shock setting in. Without intervention, he had perhaps 2 hours before the poison reached his heart and stopped it permanently. With intervention, with the kind of intensive care only available at proper medical facilities, he might have a chance. The nearest garrison with a full medical staff was Ironhold Fortress, 18 miles to the south. 18 miles of rough terrain through territory that might be hostile if this wolf's enemies were still searching for survivors. 18 miles carrying a creature who probably weighed twice what she did, using a body that had never been strong enough for ordinary tasks, let alone extraordinary ones. Elara looked down at her thin arms, her fragile bones, her omega nature that made her the weakest wolf in any pack. She looked at the dying alpha before her, at the silver arrows that needed extraction, at the poison that needed treatment. She did the mathematics of the situation and arrived at the inevitable conclusion. What she was contemplating was not just difficult, it was impossible. But somewhere in the back of her mind, her father's voice spoke the words he had taught her when she was too young to understand their weight. Duty is doing what must be done, even when you can't. She reached out and placed her hand on the wolf's massive head, feeling the heat of fever burning beneath fur matted with blood. His wolf spirit stirred at her touch, responding to her omega nature with an instinct older than conscious thought. Pack helped pack. Wolves protected wolves. In their most primal selves, before hierarchy and politics complicated everything, they were bound by chains of duty stronger than steel. Elara's weak wolf spirit, that pathetic thing everyone dismissed as barely there, reached out tentatively toward the dying alpha's essence. She felt his pain, his guilt, his bone-deep weariness that came from carrying burdens too heavy for any single soul. She felt the damage in him that went deeper than silver arrows, the wounds of the spirit that no medicine could treat. She felt him suffering, and something in her responded with absolute certainty. She could not save her father. She had been too young, too inexperienced, too weak. But she was not too young anymore. She had learned her craft through necessity and desperation, and the accumulated wisdom of a mentor who understood what it meant to be dismissed by those who should have known better. She had skills that mattered, strength that did not require muscles, determination forged in the fires of a lifetime spent proving her worth to people who refused to see it. "I did not save my father," she said aloud, the words a vow to the dying wolf before her and to whatever power might be listening. "But I will save you." She began with the arrows, the ones that could be safely removed without causing more damage than they prevented. Her field medicine knowledge guided her hands as she assessed trajectory and depth, determining which projectiles were holding blood vessels closed and which were simply poisoning him from within. She worked quickly but carefully, using techniques Miriam had taught her for battlefield trauma. Each extraction brought fresh blood, but also relief, as the immediate source of silver contamination was removed from his system. She packed the wounds with winterbloom poultice, the supply she had gathered that very morning now pressed into service, saving a life, instead of restocking her cottage. She used strips torn from her own dress to create pressure bandages, working with materials that were inadequate to the task, but all she had available. She gave him stimulant herbs to keep his heart beating, pain suppressants to ease his suffering into something more bearable. When she had done everything her skills allowed, Elara sat back and faced the next impossible choice. She could stay here with him, hoping that search parties might find them before the poison won its slow race toward his heart. She could leave him and try to bring help back, though she knew she would never find this place again in time. Or she could attempt the impossible thing, the choice that logic said would kill them both. But instinct insisted was their only real chance. She looked at the wolf before her, at the creature who represented everything she was not. Powerful where she was weak, important where she was insignificant, whole where she was broken, but also suffering, dying, abandoned by whatever forces had reduced him to this state. He needed help that only she could provide, in a form that would cost her everything she had to give. Elara stood on trembling legs, her weak body already protesting what she was about to demand of it. She positioned herself beside the massive wolf and began the process of lifting him. Physics said it should have been impossible. Her muscles screamed that it was beyond her capacity. Her omega nature whimpered that this was not her burden to carry. But her father's words echoed through her mind, and her hands found purchase beneath the wolf's shoulders, and something deep in her soul simply refused to accept the limitations everyone had always assigned to her. The first step was agony. The second brought tears streaming down her face that she did not bother to wipe away. By the third step, Ilara had entered a state beyond pain, a place where the body's protests became background noise to the singular purpose driving her forward. She had 18 miles between her and salvation. She had a dying wolf on her back whose weight threatened to snap her spine with every movement. She had determination forged in the crucible of a lifetime spent being told she was not enough. She started walking. The first mile passed in a haze of pure survival. Ilara focused on the immediate, on placing one foot in front of the other, on maintaining balance under a burden that should not have been possible to carry. She talked to herself in a steady stream of encouragement and denial, her voice the only sound in the quiet forest besides her labored breathing and the wolf's shallow panting. Just one more step, that is all. Just one more step. The mantra became her world, reducing everything to the smallest possible unit of progress. She could not think about 18 miles. She could not contemplate the mathematical impossibility of what she was attempting. She could only focus on the next single step, and then the next, and then the next, each one a small victory that accumulated into something approaching progress. The second mile introduced her to a kind of suffering she had only read about in her father's journals, accounts of forced marches and battlefield ordeals that had seemed like exaggeration until she lived her own version. Her legs transformed from limbs into columns of fire, muscles tearing themselves apart under sustained strain they were never designed to bear. Her back felt like it was being crushed by the weight pressing down on it, vertebrae compressing in ways that would leave permanent damage. But she did not stop. Could not stop. Because stopping meant death for the creature she carried, and she had made a vow in that hollow beneath the ancient oak. She had promised to save him, and Ilara Nightingale was her father's daughter. She kept her promises even when keeping them destroyed her. The third mile brought hallucinations, her overtaxed mind creating phantoms in the forest around her. She saw her father walking beside her, his face proud and peaceful. She saw Miriam shaking her head in disappointed resignation. She saw wolves moving through the trees, ancient spirits of the forest, watching her struggle with expressions she could not read. Through it all, she kept walking. Through it all, she maintained her death grip on the unconscious Alpha, refusing to let him fall, refusing to acknowledge the screaming in her muscles and the darkness creeping into the edges of her vision. She had been weak her entire life. Today, for this impossible journey, she would be strong enough. She would be strong enough because the alternative was unacceptable. The wolf on her back stirred occasionally, his spirit brushing against hers in moments of semi-consciousness. Each time he did, Ilara felt something pass between them, a connection forming that transcended the normal bonds of pack and hierarchy. His damaged wolf recognized her gentle presence and drew comfort from it. Her weak wolf found unexpected strength in his need, discovering reserves she had never known existed. They were helping each other, she realized, through the fog of exhaustion. She was carrying his body toward salvation, and he was lending her the strength to do it, some deep well of alpha power that responded to her omega nature and poured itself into her failing frame. It should not have been possible. The supernatural bond between them should not have formed so quickly or run so deep. But desperation created connections that normal circumstances never allowed, and both of them were desperate beyond measure. The fourth mile brought Ilara to the stream crossing, the shallow ford that represented both obstacle and opportunity. The water was cold, fed by mountain springs that never warmed even in summer's height. She waded in without hesitation, gasping as the current swirled around her knees, then her thighs, then her waist. The wolf's weight dragged her down, threatening to pull them both under with every step. She fell halfway across, her foot catching on a submerged rock, both of them going under in a chaos of splashing water and desperate flailing. Ilara kept his head above the surface through instinct and training, her medic's knowledge reminding her even in crisis that drowning was a faster death than silver poisoning. She sacrificed her own air, her own ability to breathe, to keep him from inhaling water. When she finally dragged them both onto the far bank, she lay there shaking and choking, her body demanding rest that she could not afford to give. The sun had moved significantly across the sky. Hours had passed. She had covered perhaps 4 miles of the 18 she needed. The mathematics remained impossible, but impossibility had lost its meaning somewhere around the 2nd mile when she had transcended normal limitations and entered a state of pure will. She forced herself upright, every movement sending fresh waves of agony through her exhausted frame. The wolf had not stirred during the crossing, his breathing even more shallow than before. The silver poison was advancing despite her earlier treatment, working its way toward his heart with patient inevitability. If she did not reach Ironhold Fortress soon, no amount of medicine would save him. Elara adjusted her grip, finding new purchase points on his massive frame, and continued walking. The forest stretched endlessly before her, trees marching toward a horizon she could not see. She had 14 miles remaining. She had perhaps 4 hours of daylight. She had a body that should have given up miles ago. She had duty, and duty was all that mattered. The miles blurred together after that, becoming a continuous experience of suffering and determination. Elara stopped tracking distance, stopped trying to measure progress. She simply walked, one step at a time. Her world narrowed to the ground immediately before her, and the weight on her back, and the voice in her head that refused to accept surrender. Just one more step, that is all, just one more step. She talked to the wolf as she walked, though he could not hear her. She told him about Thornvale, about the leaning houses, and the stubborn people who refused to leave, despite having every reason to abandon their village to the wilderness. She told him about her herb garden, about her dream of someday having a real facility where she could grow medicines instead of scavenging them from dangerous places. She told him about her father, about the soldier who had taught her that duty meant showing up when everyone else found reasons to walk away. She told him these things because she needed the sound of her own voice to drown out the screaming of her muscles and the pounding of her overtaxed heart. She told him because if she was going to die on this forest path, she wanted her last words to be about something meaningful, something that proved her brief life had contained moments of beauty and purpose. The sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in colors that would have been gorgeous under any other circumstances. Elara did not look up to appreciate them. Her entire world had become the path before her, the wolf on her back, and the desperate race against time and biology that she was losing step by excruciating step. By her rough estimate, she had been walking for 16 hours. 16 hours of sustained agony that should have killed her miles ago. But then, cresting a rise she did not remember climbing, she saw it. Distant lights flickering to life in the gathering dusk. Ironhold Fortress, the garrison that represented salvation if only she could reach it. 3 miles, perhaps 4. An impossible distance under normal circumstances. Today, after everything she had already endured, it might as well have been the width of the world. Elara looked at those distant lights through eyes blurred with tears and exhaustion. She looked at her trembling legs, at her hands that had gone numb from gripping the wolf's fur. She felt her body failing, shutting down after hours of impossible effort. She felt death approaching for both of them, patient and inevitable. And she kept walking. The final miles were a test of will over flesh, of spirit over circumstance. Elara's body moved beyond conscious control, animated by something deeper than physical capacity. Her weak wolf, that pathetic creature everyone dismissed, burned with a determination that transformed weakness into something approaching transcendence. She was not strong. She had never been strong, but she was stubborn beyond measure, and sometimes stubborn was enough. She walked until the distant lights became close lights. She walked until the forest gave way to cleared ground. She walked until voices called out in alarm and hands reached for the wolf she carried. She walked until duty was fulfilled and her promise was kept. Then, and only then, did Alara Nightingale allow herself to fall. The last thing she saw before darkness claimed her was the wolf's eyes opening, golden and full of pain and wonder, looking at her with an intensity that seemed to see straight through to her soul. The last thing she heard was someone shouting for healers, for stretchers, for help that was finally arriving too late to matter. The last thing she felt was satisfaction, bone deep and absolute. She had done the impossible thing. She had carried an Alpha King 18 miles through hostile territory and delivered him alive to salvation. She had honored her father's memory and kept her vow and proved that weakness was only a label others applied, not a truth she was required to accept. Alara collapsed into unconsciousness with a smile on her face, her duty complete, her promise fulfilled. Whatever came next, she had already won the only victory that mattered. She had shown up when everyone else would have walked away. On the morning of the 5th day after her impossible journey, Alara woke to pain that felt like a living thing, something with teeth and claws that had taken up residence in every muscle and bone of her body. The ceiling above her was unfamiliar, rough-hewn beams instead of the familiar plaster of her cottage in Thornvale. Sunlight streamed through a window to her left, too bright and too cheerful for the agony that greeted her return to consciousness. She tried to sit up and immediately regretted the attempt. Every nerve ending screamed protest, her body making abundantly clear that it was not yet ready to resume normal operations. She fell back against the pillow with a groan that emerged as barely more than a whisper, her throat raw from 3 days of unconsciousness. A door opened somewhere beyond her field of vision. Footsteps approached, quick and professional. A woman's face appeared above her, weathered and sharp-eyed, radiating the kind of competence that came from decades of dealing with the broken and dying. She introduced herself as Chief Healer Brennan of Ironhold Fortress, a woman perhaps 50 years old, whose brisk efficiency could not quite hide the concern in her eyes. 3 days you have been under, Healer Brennan said, already beginning her examination with hands that were gentle despite their efficiency. It is now the morning of day 5 since the ambush. Your body experienced catastrophic trauma. Multiple muscle tears, severe spinal compression, nerve damage in both legs. By all medical understanding, you should not have been able to walk at all, let alone carry a 240-pound Alpha for 18 miles. Day 5. The knowledge hit Alara like a physical blow. She had lost 3 days to darkness while the world continued without her. She tried to speak, to ask the question that mattered more than her own condition, but her voice failed to cooperate. Only a croak emerged, painful and useless. Healer Brennan seemed to understand anyway. The older woman's expression shifted, becoming something complicated that Alara could not fully read. Concern, perhaps, or curiosity, or both mixed with emotions that had no simple names. "The wolf you carried is alive," she said carefully, watching Alara's reaction. Though it was close, very close. The silver poisoning was hours from his heart when you arrived. If you had stopped to rest even once during your journey, the poison would have won. Relief flooded through Alara's exhausted body, so intense it brought tears to her eyes. He was alive. The impossible thing she had attempted had actually worked. For the first time in her life, she had done something that defied expectations, that transcended the limitations everyone had always assigned to her. But Healer Brennan was still speaking, her tone growing more serious. "The man you saved is not simply an Alpha. He is Commander Cale Stormright, the High King of all Crimson Ridge territories, ruler of 7 allied packs, the most powerful werewolf in the western regions." The words seemed to come from very far away, filtered through the exhaustion that still clouded Alara's mind. A king. She had carried a king on her back for 18 miles, talking to him about her herb garden and her dreams of a proper healing facility. The absurdity of it threatened to overwhelm her, and she might have laughed if laughing did not hurt so much. Healer Brennan continued her examination, professional assessment mixed with scholarly curiosity. She had never seen an Omega with such a weak wolf spirit accomplish such a feat of endurance. By every measure of medical understanding, what Ilara had done should have been impossible. The human body simply could not sustain that level of effort, particularly not a body as fragile as an Omega's. Ilara had no explanation to offer. She did not understand it herself. All she knew was that when the moment had demanded everything she had somehow found more to give. Perhaps desperation unlocked doors that normal existence kept firmly closed. Perhaps the bond that had formed between her damaged wolf and the dying king's magnificent spirit had created possibilities that should not have existed. Or perhaps duty was its own kind of magic, transforming the impossible into the merely difficult through sheer force of will. That same afternoon, day 5 of her recovery, a visitor appeared at her bedside. Healer Miriam Stonefield stood in the doorway, her weathered face showing emotions that ranged from pride to fury to something that looked remarkably like grief. She had traveled from Thornvale the moment word reached her of what Ilara had done. She crossed the room in 3 quick strides and took Ilara's hand in both of hers, holding on as if afraid her student might disappear. "You foolish, brave, impossible girl!" Miriam's voice cracked on the words. "What were you thinking? What could possibly have made you believe you could survive something like this?" Ilara met her mentor's eyes and spoke the truth as simply as she knew how. "He was dying. I could save him. That was all the thinking required." Miriam sat heavily in the chair beside the bed, her anger draining away to leave only the pride and the grief. She had taught Ilara everything about field medicine, about tending wounds and easing suffering, but she had also taught her student about the costs of caregiving, about knowing when to save a life and when to let go. This situation had violated every lesson about self-preservation, every rule about accepting the limitations of circumstance. "Your father would have been proud," Miriam said finally, and the words carried weight that simple praise could not convey. "He always said you had more courage than sense. He would have been right." They sat together in comfortable silence, teacher and student, 2 women who understood what it meant to practice healing in a world that did not value their contributions. Eventually, Miriam shared news from Thornvale, updates about patients and supplies, and the small dramas that defined life in a forgotten village. The normalcy of it soothed something in Ilara's soul, reminding her that she had a place to return to when this strange interlude ended. But even as Miriam spoke of home, Ilara found her thoughts drifting to the room down the hall where the king recovered from his own injuries. She had not seen him since that moment of eye contact before unconsciousness claimed her. She did not know if he even remembered her presence during his rescue. For all she knew, she was nothing more than a curious footnote in his return to health, the weak Omega who had done one remarkable thing before, fading back into appropriate insignificance. The thought should not have bothered her. She had not saved him for recognition or reward. She had done it because duty demanded it, because she could not leave a dying creature when she had the power to help. But some small part of her, the part that had never quite accepted the world's assessment of her worth, wanted to know if her sacrifice had mattered beyond the purely practical. She wanted to know if he had heard her voice during that desperate journey, if her stories about Thornvale and herb gardens and sunset colors had reached him in his delirium, if any part of what they had shared during those impossible miles had created connection rather than simply accomplishing rescue. The days that followed day 5 became a test of patience and incremental progress. Healer Brennan proved to be an excellent caretaker, providing medicines that eased Ilara's suffering and foods designed to rebuild her depleted strength. By day 7, Ilara could sit up without assistance. By day 9, she managed solid food without her hands shaking, Each small victory was earned through effort that left her trembling and exhausted, but they were victories nonetheless. Taking her first painful steps with the support of parallel bars became the focus of day 10, Healer Brennan's steady encouragement, the only thing keeping her upright. But the prognosis was not encouraging. The nerve damage in her legs was severe, possibly permanent. She might walk again with assistance, but she would never move with the ease she had known before her impossible journey. The price of saving a king, it seemed, was the destruction of her own body. Alara accepted this with the same quiet resignation she had applied to every other limitation life had handed her. She was still alive. The king was still alive. Everything else was secondary to those fundamental facts. On day 11 since the ambush, she managed to walk from her bed to the window, using only a cane for support. The view looked out over the fortress courtyard, where soldiers drilled in precise formations. She watched them move through combat exercises, their strength and coordination a sharp contrast to her own damaged state. Once, she might have felt envious of their capabilities. Now she simply felt tired, and perhaps a bit satisfied that her weakness had accomplished something their strength never could have managed. That was when he appeared in her doorway. Commander Kyle Stormwright was larger than she remembered, his frame filling the entrance in a way that suggested he was accustomed to dominating any space he occupied. He wore simple clothes rather than royal finery, practical garments that did nothing to hide the bandages visible beneath his shirt. His left arm rested in a sling, and his movements carried the careful precision of someone nursing injuries not yet fully healed. But it was his eyes that captured Alara's attention and held it with force that made her breath catch. Golden eyes, the mark of a powerful alpha, but shadowed with something that looked like permanent grief. They found hers across the room and held her gaze with an intensity that seemed to see straight through to her soul. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence stretched between them, filled with questions neither seemed to know how to ask. Alara found herself studying his face in the daylight, comparing it to the fleeting impressions she had formed during their desperate journey. He was older than she had initially guessed, perhaps in his late 30s, with silver beginning to thread through dark hair. His features were strong and angular, carved by experience rather than youth. "You saved my life." His voice emerged rough, damaged by whatever ordeal had preceded his wounds, but there was strength in it nonetheless. Not the commanding tone of royalty addressing a subject, but something simpler and more genuine, one person acknowledging another's sacrifice. Alara did not know how to respond to that. Thank you seemed inadequate. You are welcome felt presumptuous. She settled for the truth, delivered as simply as she could manage given the way her heart was pounding. I could not leave you to die. Something shifted in his expression, a softening around his eyes that transformed his entire face. He crossed the room slowly, favoring his right leg, and stopped a respectful distance from where she stood by the window. Close enough for conversation, far enough to avoid crowding her space. "I was conscious during parts of your journey," he said, and Alara felt heat rise to her cheeks at the admission. "I could not move or speak, but I could hear. You talked to me about your village, about your father, about a sunset that made you weep." The embarrassment threatened to swallow her whole. She had spoken to him with the casual intimacy of someone addressing a dying friend rather than a king. She had shared pieces of herself never meant for royal ears, private things that revealed her smallness and her foolish dreams. But Kyle did not seem to find her words foolish. Instead, his expression held something that looked remarkably like gratitude mixed with wonder. "During the worst of the silver poisoning, when the toxin began reaching my mind and filling it with nightmares, your voice was an anchor. The simple beauty of your descriptions gave me something to hold on to when the pain threatened to drag me under completely." He paused, searching for words that seemed difficult to find. "I dreamed of your herb garden. I dreamed of watching colors paint the sky in impossible shades. I dreamed of a woman with a voice like quiet water, carrying me through endless darkness toward distant light. The intimacy of his words struck Alara with unexpected force, creating a connection between them that transcended normal boundaries of rank and station. She had shared pieces of herself during that journey, never expecting them to matter, never imagining they would be heard. But he had heard them. He had held on to them. They had helped save his life just as surely as her physical efforts. They stood together by the window, neither quite willing to break the fragile moment stretching between them. Outside, soldiers continued their drills, unaware that something profound was happening in the recovery room above them. The world moved on in its eternal patterns, unconcerned with the quiet connection forming between a broken king and a damaged Omega. In the days that followed, from day 12 through day 17, a pattern established itself that neither of them had planned, but both seemed to need. Each afternoon, when healing duties permitted, Kael would appear at Alara's door. Sometimes he brought books to read aloud while she rested. Sometimes he simply sat in comfortable silence, two wounded souls sharing space without the need for constant conversation. But more often they talked, not about politics or power or the practical matters that surely demanded a king's attention. They spoke instead of childhood memories and adult disappointments, of dreams abandoned and hopes still secretly harbored. They discussed the weight of expectations and the loneliness of being perpetually misunderstood. Kael proved to be nothing like the distant, imperious ruler Alara had imagined. He was thoughtful and curious, asking questions about her life in Thornvale with genuine interest rather than polite condescension. He wanted to know about her herb collecting, about the properties of different plants, about the satisfaction of healing someone who had been given up for lost. He listened to her answers with an attention that made her feel, for the first time in her life, that her experiences mattered to someone beyond herself, that her small world of forgotten villages and gathered medicines contained wisdom worth hearing. That weakness of body did not equal insignificance of insight. In return, he shared pieces of his own story that Alara suspected few others had ever heard. He told her about inheriting the throne at 22 after his father's sudden death in a border skirmish. 17 years ago now. He was 39 years old and felt decades older from the weight of command. About the crushing responsibility of leading 7 allied packs through a period of political instability. He spoke of the isolation that came with power, the way it created walls between him and everyone around him, the impossibility of knowing whether anyone saw him as a person rather than a position. His golden eyes grew distant during these revelations, gazing at something beyond the walls of the recovery room, and Alara found her heart aching with recognition of his loneliness. She understood that particular pain, the experience of being surrounded by people who could not truly see you. They came from different worlds, separated by chasms of power and status that should have made connection impossible. But somehow, in the quiet hours of those afternoon conversations, the distance between them seemed to dissolve. It was on day 13 that Kael finally spoke of the disaster that had broken something fundamental in him. The ambush 2 years ago. 200 men lost to an intelligence failure he still blamed himself for. The weight of their deaths crushing him under guilt that no amount of time or distance could ease. He described the campaign with clinical precision at first, treating it like a tactical briefing rather than a personal tragedy. The objectives had been clear. The intelligence had seemed solid. The execution should have been textbook. But the enemy had known they were coming, had prepared an ambush so precise it could only have come from inside information. Within 3 hours, half his force was dead or dying, and Kael was ordering a retreat that felt like the ultimate failure of leadership. But as he spoke, the clinical distance began to crack. His voice roughened with emotion he could no longer contain. His hands clenched into fists, then opened helplessly, physical manifestations of a grief that demanded outlet. The 200 who died had not been numbers on a tactical display. They had been men he knew by name, soldiers who had trusted him to bring them home. Every funeral he attended, every family he faced, every empty bunk in the barracks was a fresh reminder that he had failed them. "My wolf went silent that day," Cale said, the admission emerging like pulling a blade from an old wound. "After the funerals, after standing over 200 fresh graves and accepting that my decisions had put them there, something in me broke. My wolf spirit retreated into the deepest parts of my consciousness and refused to speak. For 2 years I have been incomplete, strong enough to function but hollow in ways that no amount of discipline could fill." He looked at Alara then, really looked at her, and she saw the depth of his suffering laid bare without pretense or protection. "I thought my wolf was punishing me for being a poor leader, for getting good men killed through my arrogance and tactical blindness. I thought I did not deserve my strength if I was going to use it so poorly." Alara understood survivor's guilt in ways that textbook knowledge could never convey. She had watched it destroy her father over 5 slow years, consuming him from within while his physical wounds consumed his body. She knew the corrosive nature of blame turned inward, the way it poisoned everything it touched, until even breathing felt like an act of theft from the dead. She spoke carefully, choosing words that cut through justification and excuse to reach the core truth he needed to hear. "Your wolf is punishing you for being mortal, for making mistakes that humans make. That is not justice. That is just pain wearing the mask of responsibility." The statement seemed to strike him with physical force. He went very still, his golden eyes widening as if she had revealed something he had never considered. No one had said this to him before. No one had dared suggest that his guilt might be disproportionate to his actual failure, that carrying the weight of 200 deaths alone was itself a kind of arrogance. "They trusted me," he said, but his voice held uncertainty now, the first crack in the armor of his self-condemnation. "They trusted you to lead them, to make the best decisions you could with the information you had, to bring them home if possible." Alara moved closer, drawn by instinct to offer comfort in the only way she knew. "You did not betray that trust by being imperfect. You honored it by carrying their deaths instead of forgetting them. But carrying them alone, refusing all help, punishing yourself eternally for being human rather than divine, that is not honor. That is just suffering for its own sake." Something in Kael's carefully maintained control began to fracture. She could see it in the tightness around his eyes, in the way his breath came faster and more shallow. 2 years of grief and guilt, held back by iron discipline and royal responsibility, suddenly demanding release. He did not break down completely. Kings did not have that luxury, even in private moments with witnesses who would keep their secrets. But his composure cracked enough to show the man beneath the crown, the person who hurt and doubted and carried burdens too heavy for any single soul. Alara reached out and took his hand, the gesture instinctive and born from compassion rather than conscious thought. His skin was warm beneath her fingers, alive with the vitality slowly returning to his healing body. He went still at her touch, his eyes dropping to where their hands connected, and for a moment she feared she had overstepped some invisible boundary that existed between kings and common omegas. Then his hand turned beneath hers, his fingers intertwining with her own, and he held on as if she were an anchor in a storm he had been weathering alone for far too long. They sat together in the golden afternoon light, hands clasped, breathing together, and something that had been tentative and uncertain crystallized into something real. The connection between them was no longer simply gratitude for rescue or curiosity about each other's worlds. It had become something deeper, a recognition of kinship between damaged souls who understood what it meant to carry impossible burdens. They were both broken in ways that mattered, both struggling under weights that should have crushed them but somehow had not. Both lonely in crowds, misunderstood by those who should have known better, yearning for connection that saw past surface to substance. Neither of them spoke. Words seemed inadequate to the moment, too small to contain what was passing between them. They simply existed together, two people finding unexpected peace in shared understanding, and the silence held more meaning than any declaration could have conveyed. The spell broke when Captain Dane Blackwater appeared in the doorway, clearing his throat apologetically. Military necessity called, and kings could not ignore it indefinitely, no matter how much they might wish otherwise. Kael squeezed Alara's hand once more before releasing it, the gesture conveying promise rather than goodbye. He stood slowly, his injuries making the movement careful, and followed his captain from the room. But he looked back from the doorway, his golden eyes finding hers one final time. The expression on his face held gratitude and wonder, and something else she could not quite name but felt echoing in her own chest. Then he was gone, and Alara was left alone with her thundering heart and the lingering warmth of his touch on her skin. That night, for the first time since her impossible journey, Alara slept peacefully. She dreamed of running through forests as a wolf, her weak omega form somehow keeping pace with a magnificent golden alpha who ran beside her with joy rather than the grief that normally shadowed his eyes. It was only a dream, but it felt prophetic in ways she did not yet understand. The morning of day 12 brought a summons that changed everything. A military funeral was to be held that afternoon for Sergeant Marcus Thornfield, whose body had been recovered from the ambush site and transported to Ironhold with full honors. The ceremony would include veterans from across the territories, men whose lives Marcus had touched during his 40 years of service. Alara attended despite her injuries, using her cane to navigate the crowds of soldiers who had come to pay their respects to a man who had served longer than many of them had been alive. The fortress courtyard had been transformed into a memorial space, with Marcus's coffin positioned on a raised platform and draped with military colors. Beside it stood a display of his decorations and citations, a physical record of 4 decades spent in service to others. The sight made Alara's chest tight with vicarious grief for a man she had never known, but whose sacrifice had made her own journey possible. Without Marcus's final stand, Kael would have been captured in that kill zone. Without his covering fire, the other soldiers would not have escaped. His death had purchased lives, including the life of the king Alara had carried 18 miles. Veterans spoke one after another, each sharing stories of how Sergeant Marcus Thornfield had saved their lives, taught them courage, been a father figure when they needed one most. The testimonials painted a picture of a man who had understood that leadership was about building people up rather than tearing them down, about creating strength in others rather than hoarding it for yourself. One grizzled soldier, his face scarred from decades of combat, spoke of how Marcus had talked him out of ending his own life after a particularly brutal campaign. Another told of Marcus spending 3 days carrying a wounded comrade through enemy territory when abandoning him would have been the tactically sound choice. When it came time for Kael to deliver the eulogy, the king stood before the assembled crowd and found himself unable to speak. The words he had prepared dissolved in the face of emotion too large to contain in formal language. He stood at the podium, grief evident on his face, while silence stretched uncomfortable, and the crowd waited with respectful patience. Alara watched from her position near the back, saw his paralysis, and understood its source. Some losses were too profound for words, some grief too overwhelming for public expression. Kael was failing in this moment not because he was weak, but because he was human and hurting, and the man he was supposed to eulogize had been more father than subordinate. The decision came without conscious thought. Alara stood, painful with her cane and damaged legs, and began making her way toward the front. Soldiers parted to let her through, their expressions showing surprise mixed with respect. The weak Omega who had carried their king 18 miles commanded a certain authority now, earned through action rather than granted by birth. She reached the podium and stood beside Kael, her small frame dwarfed by his larger one. She looked out at the sea of veteran faces, at the grizzled warriors who had seen too much death and carried too many scars. She had never spoken to a crowd this size, had never presumed to have words worth hearing by men like these. But she thought of her father, the soldier who had taught her about duty and sacrifice. She thought of the journey that had brought her to this moment. And she spoke from the heart, trusting that truth would be enough, even if eloquence failed her. I never knew Sergeant Marcus Thornfield, but he saved my life anyway. Her voice carried clearly in the silent space, strengthened by conviction, if not volume. His last act was protecting the man who would protect all of you. That is the definition of brotherhood. Sacrifice for people you will never meet. Trust in the chain that links us all. He was the first link. We carry the chain forward. Chain. The simplicity of her words seemed to unlock something in the gathered crowd. She saw men nodding, saw tears on weathered faces, saw recognition of a truth they all understood but rarely articulated. Service was not about individual glory. It was about ensuring that the people who came after you were stronger, safer, better prepared than you had been. Marcus had embodied that principle for 40 years, and his legacy lived on in every soldier he had trained and every life he had touched. Elara stepped back, yielding the podium to Kael, and saw gratitude in his eyes mixed with wonder. She had given him the words he could not find, had expressed the grief he could not voice. She had stood beside him in his moment of failure and transformed it into something approaching grace. Kael turned to the crowd, his composure restored by her intervention, and added his own tribute in a voice roughened by emotion, but steady with conviction. Old Bear taught me that command is not about being the strongest or the smartest or the most fearless. It is about ensuring your people are better when you are done than when you started. He succeeded. Look at all of you. He built an army not through fear or domination, but through patient mentorship and unwavering belief that everyone could be more than they thought possible. That is the legacy he leaves. That is the standard we must maintain. After the ceremony ended and crowds dispersed to private mourning, Kael found Elara in the quiet space behind the memorial chapel. They stood together without speaking, two people who had discovered that words were sometimes inadequate to what needed expressing. Finally, Kael broke the silence. You gave him words I could not find. You honored him in ways I was failing to achieve. Thank you. Elara met his eyes and saw the depth of his gratitude, the growing awareness that they were becoming something to each other that transcended normal categories of relationship. You gave them meaning by standing beside me. We honored him together. That is how it should be. Understanding passed between them, wordless but complete. They were stronger together than apart. They complemented each other's weaknesses and amplified each other's strengths. What had begun as rescue and recovery was transforming into partnership, and neither of them quite knew what to do with that knowledge, except acknowledge its truth. The days following Marcus's funeral, days 13 through 17, were marked by quiet conversations that built intimacy through shared vulnerability. But in the background, Captain Dane's investigation continued its methodical work. On day 18, 3 weeks after the ambush that had nearly killed their king, the investigation reached its devastating conclusion. Captain Dane requested an urgent meeting with Kael that morning, his expression grim enough to suggest the matter was serious. Elara was not invited, of course. Military briefings were not places for civilian Omegas, no matter what service they had rendered. But the fortress was small enough that rumors spread quickly, and by afternoon she had learned the basic facts. The investigation into the ambush had reached its conclusion. 3 weeks of careful evidence gathering, interrogations of survivors, analysis of coded messages intercepted from Northern Coalition forces. Evidence pointed to an intelligence leak from High Command, someone close to the king who had sold information to Northern Coalition forces. financial records showing payments of Northern Coalition gold, coded messages found in personal quarters, timeline analysis that matched perfectly with enemy movements. All of it pointed to a single source, Lord Victor Stormwright, the king's older brother. The revelation sent shockwaves through the fortress. Victor had been Kael's most trusted advisor, his confidant during the dark years after their father's death, the one person who supposedly understood the burdens of leadership. He had helped Kael through the depression following the disaster 2 years ago, had stood beside him at 200 funerals, had sworn loyalty with every appearance of sincerity, and he had sold his brother to enemies for gold and political advantage. Alara did not see Kael for the next 2 days, days 19 and 20. He shut himself in his quarters, refusing visitors and ignoring the demands of governance. Captain Dane stood guard outside the door, his expression conveying both worry and understanding. Some betrayals cut too deep for immediate processing. Some wounds required solitude to even begin healing. On day 21, the 3rd day after Victor's betrayal was revealed, Alara heard sounds from Kael's quarters that made her blood run cold. Crashes and roars of rage, the unmistakable sounds of someone's control finally shattering completely. She moved down the corridor despite Dane's half-hearted attempt to stop her, driven by instinct that had nothing to do with protocol and everything to do with recognizing the sound of a soul in crisis. She found Kael in the ruins of his room, furniture destroyed and belongings scattered like the aftermath of a battle. He stood in the center of the chaos, chest heaving with exertion and emotion, his wolf spirit manifesting in ways it had not done in 2 years. Golden light flickered around him, the visible expression of supernatural power responding to psychological anguish. His eyes, when they found hers, held madness and grief in equal measure. "My brother." The words emerged as something between a roar and a sob. "He was my brother. We fought together, bled together. He held me when Father died. He was supposed to be the one person I could trust without question." Alara did not try to calm him with platitudes or minimize his pain with false comfort. She simply stood in the doorway, bearing witness to his agony without trying to fix what could not be fixed. Sometimes the most important thing you could do for someone in crisis was acknowledge their right to feel what they felt without judgment or interference. Kael's rage burned itself out gradually, his supernatural power fading as exhaustion replaced fury. When he finally collapsed onto the debris of his bed, his face was wet with tears he had probably not shed in years. The proud king, the powerful alpha, reduced to human vulnerability by a betrayal that cut deeper than any physical wound. Alara crossed the room slowly, navigating the wreckage with her cane, and sat beside him on the damaged bed. She did not speak, did not try to offer wisdom she did not possess. She simply placed her hand on his shoulder, skin-to-skin contact that conveyed solidarity without words. He turned toward her touch like a plant seeking sunlight, his larger frame folding against hers in a way that should have been awkward but felt strangely natural. They sat together in the ruins, 2 damaged people finding comfort in shared brokenness, and the silence between them held understanding that transcended language. When Kael finally spoke again, his voice was hoarse from shouting and tears. "How do I trust anyone now? If my own brother could betray me, who is safe? Who is real?" Alara thought about her answer carefully before responding. "You start by trusting the people who have already proven themselves through action rather than words. Captain Dane stayed with you when fleeing would have been safer. Old Bear Marcus died protecting you when surviving would have been easier. I carried you 18 miles when leaving you would have been the rational choice." She paused, making sure he was listening before continuing. "Trust is not about finding people who will never disappoint you. It is about recognizing the ones who show up when circumstances give them every excuse to walk away. Your brother failed that test. Others have passed it. Judge people by their actions under pressure, not by their promises during peace." The wisdom in her words seemed to reach him through the fog of his grief. He straightened slightly, some small measure of composure returning to his features. You are right. I know you are right. But knowing and feeling are different things. They are, Alara agreed. Give yourself permission to feel the betrayal without letting it define all your future relationships. That is the balance. Acknowledge the wound without letting it become your identity. They sat together as afternoon faded into evening, talking sometimes and sitting in silence at others. Gradually, the raw edges of Kael's grief began to dull into something more manageable. Not healed, not even close, but survivable, which was all anyone could ask in the immediate aftermath of this kind of devastation. When Captain Dane finally insisted that the king needed rest and privacy, Alara left reluctantly, but she paused at the door, looking back at Kael one more time. You are not alone in this. Whatever comes next, you have people who will stand with you. Remember that when the darkness feels overwhelming. His golden eyes met hers across the damaged room, and something passed between them that felt like a promise being made without words. Then she was gone, and Kael was left alone with his grief and his growing certainty that the Omega who had saved his life was becoming essential to him in ways that transcended simple gratitude. Over the next 3 days, days 22 through 24, Kael emerged slowly from his isolation. The raw edges of his grief over Victor's betrayal began to dull into something more manageable, not healed, not even close, but survivable, which was all anyone could ask in the immediate aftermath of this kind of devastation. Alara was there for him during those difficult days, offering presence without pressure, understanding without judgment. They talked sometimes about Victor, about trust and family, and how the two could betray each other so completely, but more often they simply existed together in companionable silence, two people who had discovered that sometimes the greatest comfort came not from words, but from shared space. On day 24, messengers arrived with formal summons from the Royal Council. They demanded Kael's immediate return to Ironspire capital. The Northern Coalition was still massing forces on the border. Allied pacts were questioning the stability of leadership compromised by such profound betrayal. Every day Kael spent recovering in Ironhold Fortress was another day of growing political instability. That evening, on the 25th day since the ambush that had nearly killed them both, Kael came to Alara's room with a request that carried weight beyond its simple phrasing. Come with me to Ironspire. Not as a curiosity or a witness to be questioned, as someone whose counsel I value, as someone whose presence I need. Alara understood what he was really asking. Come into his world of politics and power. Leave behind the simple safety of Thornvale and step into complexities that could destroy her. Risk everything familiar for something uncertain and probably dangerous. She thought about her cottage in the forgotten village, about the patients who depended on her care, and the herbs she gathered from forest edges. She thought about Miriam's warnings and her father's teachings about knowing your limitations. Every practical consideration argued for refusing, for maintaining the boundaries that separated her small world from his vast one. But she also thought about afternoons spent in quiet conversation, about hands clasped in shared understanding, about the connection forming between them that felt more real than anything she had experienced before. She thought about duty, and about how sometimes duty meant stepping toward fear rather than away from it. Yes, she said simply, and watched relief flood his features. I will come with you. The journey to Ironspire would take 5 days by carriage, traveling with an armed escort through territories that might harbor enemy sympathizers. It would be the first time Alara had ventured more than 20 miles from Thornvale. The first time she would see a real city, experience the world beyond her limited borders. The first time she would face the reality of what it meant to matter to a king in a world that valued power above all else. As she prepared for departure, packing the few possessions she owned into a single small bag, Alara caught her reflection in the polished metal that served as a mirror. She looked different than she had a month ago, thinner from her ordeal, marked by pain and recovery. But there was something else, too, something in her eyes that had not been there before. confidence perhaps, or simply the knowledge that she had survived the impossible and emerged stronger for it. That night, the night before their departure, Alara dreamed again of running through forests as a wolf, but this time the golden alpha beside her was whole and healed, his spirit no longer shadowed by grief. They ran together with joy, two souls in perfect synchronization, and when she woke in the deep hours before dawn, she could still feel the warmth of that connection. In his own quarters, Kyle woke from the same dream with wonder growing in his chest. His wolf had spoken to him for the first time in 2 years, not with words but with feelings that transcended language. Joy, recognition, the bone-deep certainty of finding something precious that had been missing without him realizing it was gone. He and Alara had shared a dream. Their wolves had run together while their human bodies slept in separate rooms. It should not have been possible. The supernatural bond between them should not have formed so quickly or reached such depths. But both of them felt it now, undeniable, and growing stronger with each passing day. A connection was forming between them that would change everything. They both knew it. They both felt the weight of implications neither was ready to fully examine. But as dawn broke over Ironhold Fortress and preparations began for the journey to the capital, one thing was certain. Whatever awaited them in Ironspire, whatever challenges and dangers lay ahead, they would face them together. The weak Omega and the broken King, finding strength in each other that neither possessed alone. The chain that Marcus had died protecting would hold, and it was stronger than anyone imagined. The journey to Ironspire capital took 5 days, as promised, though the miles passed like weeks for the weight of expectation they carried. Alara traveled in a carriage near the center of the military formation, surrounded by soldiers whose purpose was protection, but whose presence felt more like observation. She was entering a world where every gesture would be scrutinized, every word weighed for political meaning, every weakness exploited by those who saw her as a threat to the natural order. Captain Dane Blackwater commanded the escort with the same methodical precision he brought to all military operations. 200 soldiers, enough to discourage opportunistic attacks, but not so many as to suggest fear. Scouts ranged ahead and to the flanks, watching for signs of Northern Coalition activity or sympathizers who might attempt to disrupt the King's return. The formation moved with practiced efficiency, covering 30 miles each day through territories that grew progressively more prosperous as they approached the heart of Crimson Ridge power. Kyle rode at the front when his healing injuries permitted, but each evening he came to Alara's carriage to share the evening meal and speak of things that had nothing to do with politics or war. They talked about the changing landscape, about the small villages they passed, and the lives contained within them. They spoke of childhood dreams and adult realities, of the distance between who they had thought they would become and whose circumstances had shaped them into being. On the third night, day 27 since the ambush, Kyle shared something he had told no one else. The 200 men who died 2 years ago haunted him still, but not in the way people assumed. It was not their deaths that tormented his dreams. It was their trust, the way they had looked at him before the ambush, confident that their king would bring them home. The weight of that trust, betrayed by his failure, crushed him more thoroughly than any grief over their passing. "I dream of their faces," he said quietly, his golden eyes distant with memory. "Not dying, just looking at me, believing in me. That is the image I cannot escape." Alara understood in ways that words could not fully express. Her father had looked at her the same way during his final illness, trusting that she could ease his suffering even when they both knew she lacked the skill to save him. That trust, combined with her inability to fulfill it, had shaped every choice she made afterward. The determination to be better, to learn more, to never again fail someone who depended on her. "They trusted you to try," she said carefully, "not to be perfect, just to give everything you had. You did that. Their deaths are tragic, but not your failure. The failure would have been not trying, not caring, not carrying their memory forward with the weight it deserves. Something in Cale's expression shifted, a slight easing of the permanent tension he carried. He reached across the small space between them and took her hand, the gesture now familiar, but no less meaningful for its repetition. They sat together as twilight deepened into night, two damaged souls finding comfort in shared understanding. The capital announced itself on the morning of day 30, not with walls or towers, but with the density of human activity. The road widened to accommodate increased traffic. Merchants' wagons appeared with growing frequency, carrying goods from across the territories. Smaller paths joined the main thoroughfare, like tributaries feeding a river, each one adding to the flow of people and commerce, moving toward the center of power. Iron Spire itself rose from the landscape like a declaration of permanence. White stone walls 30 feet high, reinforced with iron and enchanted with protective wards that made Alara's weak wolf spirit whimper at their intensity. Guard towers punctuated the walls at regular intervals, each one manned by soldiers whose attention never wavered from their assigned sectors. This was not simply a city. It was a fortress, built to withstand siege and designed to project strength to any who might contemplate challenge. The gates opened to admit the king's procession, and suddenly they were inside, surrounded by buildings that rose 3 and 4 stories high. The streets were paved with fitted stone, wide enough for wagons to pass each other with room to spare. People lined the thoroughfares to watch their king's return, and their expressions ranged from relief to curiosity to something that looked remarkably like suspicion. News of Victor's betrayal had preceded them. Everyone knew that the king's own brother had sold him to enemies. Everyone wondered what that meant for the stability of the realm. A king who could not trust his own family, how could he protect his people? The questions were unspoken, but visible in every cautious face, every guarded expression. The royal palace dominated the city center, a massive structure of white stone and dark timber that seemed to grow from the bedrock itself. Its towers reached toward the sky with architectural ambition that bordered on arrogance, and its courtyards could have swallowed Thornvale entire and still had room for gardens. This was to be Alara's new home, this monument to power that existed in a universe completely foreign to everything she had known. Captain Dane escorted her to quarters in the guest wing, rooms that were larger than her entire cottage had been. Fine furniture, woven rugs, windows with actual glass rather than oiled parchment. A servant appeared within minutes, a young woman perhaps Alara's own age, to attend to her needs and help her navigate the complexities of court life. The attention was overwhelming, the luxury almost obscene when compared to the poverty she had left behind. That first night in the palace, day 30 since the ambush, Alara stood at her window and looked out over the city spreading below like a map of lives she would never understand. She felt small and lost and profoundly out of place. The weak Omega from a forgotten village, thrust into the center of a world that valued strength above all else. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to return to Thornvale, where at least she understood her role and knew her worth. But she had made a promise. Not in words, but in the quiet moments of shared vulnerability with a broken king who needed her presence more than he needed her strength. She would stay. She would learn. She would find a way to be useful in this foreign place, just as she had found ways to be useful in Thornvale despite her weakness. The next morning brought her first real test. A summons arrived before breakfast, delivered by a palace functionary whose expression suggested he found the entire situation distasteful. The royal council wished to meet the Omega who had saved their king's life. Not a request, a command, delivered with the kind of polite hostility that made its true meaning unmistakable. Alara dressed in the finest clothes she owned, which still looked shabby compared to what the servant suggested was appropriate for court. She made her way through corridors that seemed designed to confuse outsiders, following directions that proved more complicated than any forest path she had ever navigated. By the time she reached the council chamber, her heart was pounding and her weak wolf was cowering in the deepest parts of her consciousness. The council chamber was exactly what she had feared. A long table of polished wood, surrounded by men and women whose clothing cost more than Thornvale's annual harvest. They watched her enter with expressions that ranged from curiosity to contempt, evaluating her worth with the casual cruelty of those accustomed to judging others by rigid standards. Kael sat at the head of the table, wearing the crown and formal robes that transformed him from the vulnerable man she knew into the distant king the realm expected. His golden eyes found hers across the room, conveying reassurance she desperately needed but could not quite believe. Lord Chancellor Brennus, a man perhaps 60 years old with silver hair and the bearing of someone who had spent decades accumulating power, spoke first. His tone was courteous, but his words carried steel beneath the civility. "Miss Nightingale, we have heard remarkable tales of your journey with His Majesty, 18 miles through hostile territory, carrying an alpha king who outweighs you by more than 100 pounds. Quite extraordinary for someone of your constitution." The pause before constitution made his meaning clear. Quite extraordinary for a weak Omega. Quite impossible, actually, and therefore subject to doubt. The implication hung in the air like smoke, impossible to grasp, but choking nonetheless. "I did what was necessary," Alara said, keeping her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. "Nothing more." Another council member, Lady Sarah Ironstone, leaned forward with a smile that did not reach her eyes. She was the alpha female Kael had been expected to marry for political alliance, a woman of obvious strength and impeccable lineage. Everything Alara was not. "Of course you did, dear. And we are all very grateful. The question before us now is what role you might play going forward. His Majesty has requested that you serve as an advisor, but surely you understand the complications such an arrangement presents." The complications, meaning that a weak Omega had no business in the corridors of power, meaning that her presence undermined the natural hierarchy, meaning that she was an embarrassment the council wished to manage quietly and then dismiss. Kael's voice cut through the tension with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Miss Nightingale's role is not subject to council approval. She saved my life at great personal cost. She has earned the right to whatever position I choose to offer her." Lord Brennus inclined his head with exaggerated deference. "Of course, Your Majesty. We merely suggest that certain proprieties should be observed. The nobility will have concerns. The other packs will question. In these unstable times, we cannot afford to appear weak or indecisive." And there it was, the core of their objection wrapped in reasonable language. Alara made them appear weak. Her presence suggested that the king valued sentiment over strength, emotion over practicality. In a world built on hierarchies of power, her elevation threatened the foundations everyone else depended upon. The meeting continued for another hour, a careful dance of political positioning where nothing was stated directly, but everything was understood. The council wanted Alara removed from proximity to the king. Kael refused. They suggested compromise, ways she could be honored without being visible. He declined. The impasse was absolute, and everyone left the chamber knowing that the conflict was only beginning. Alara returned to her quarters feeling like she had survived a battle despite no blows being struck. The political warfare of the court was more exhausting than any physical labor she had ever undertaken. At least with physical work, you knew when you succeeded or failed. Here, every interaction carried layers of meaning she could barely detect, let alone navigate. That afternoon, day 31, Kael came to her quarters with an expression that mixed determination with something that looked like fear. He closed the door behind him carefully, ensuring privacy, and then spoke words that changed everything. "There is something you need to know, something I have been trying to understand since the day you carried me through that forest." He paused, gathering himself. "My wolf has been speaking to me again. For the first time in 2 years I am whole, and it is because of you." Alara nodded slowly. She had suspected as much from their shared dreams, from the way her weak wolf seemed to draw strength from proximity to his powerful spirit. "It is more than simple healing," Kale continued, his voice rough with emotion he was clearly struggling to contain. "There is a bond forming between us, between our wolves, the kind of bond that occurs perhaps once in 1,000 lifetimes." He crossed to where she sat, kneeling before her so their eyes were level. The gesture from a king was so unexpected, so profoundly wrong by every rule of protocol, that Elara found herself holding her breath. "A true mate bond, Elara. Our wolves recognize each other as perfectly matched, two halves of a whole that were always meant to find each other. That is why you could carry me when you should not have been able to. Your wolf was borrowing my strength through the emergency connection forming between us. That is why I heal when you are near, why my wolf has returned to me after 2 years of silence." The implications crashed over Elara like a physical wave. True mate bonds were the subject of legends, rare phenomena that bound two wolves together so completely that neither could be whole without the other. If such a bond existed between them, then everything changed, not just for them personally, but for the entire political situation. "True mate bonds are permanent once consummated," Kyle said, and she heard both wonder and fear in his voice. "The mating bite creates a connection that cannot be broken except by death. We would be bound, spiritually and supernaturally, for the remainder of our lives." He took her hands in his, and she felt the trembling in his fingers that matched her own. "If I complete this bond with you, I can never take another mate. The council wants me to marry Lady Sarah for her territory's military alliance. But if we are true mates, I physically cannot bond with anyone else. My wolf would die slowly without you, and I would become what I was these past 2 years, broken, hollow, incomplete." Elara tried to process what he was telling her. She had the power to save him permanently, to heal the wounds that 2 years of guilt had carved into his soul. But using that power would defy the council, undermine political alliances, and thrust her into a role she was utterly unprepared to fill. "And if we do not complete the bond?" Her voice emerged as barely more than a whisper. Kyle's expression answered before his words did. "Then we both suffer. The bond is already forming. Our wolves have recognized each other. Denying that recognition will not make it disappear. It will simply turn something beautiful into something agonizing. We will be drawn to each other constantly, craving proximity we cannot have, aching with incompletion that has no cure." He stood, releasing her hands, and moved to the window where she had stood the previous night. "I did not come here to pressure you. I came to tell you the truth so you can make an informed choice. The council will demand I marry Sarah. The political situation requires it. Northern Coalition has 50,000 soldiers on our border, and we need her territory's 20,000 troops to have any hope of defending ourselves." He looked back at her, and she saw the king rather than the man, the weight of duty crushing personal desire, the burden of command that required sacrifice, even when sacrifice felt like death. "I am asking you to release me from this bond, to let me do what duty requires, even though it means both of us will suffer, because I am a king before I am a man, and the realm must come before personal happiness." The request cut deeper than any blade could have managed. He was asking her to sacrifice not just her own chance at wholeness, but his as well, to condemn them both to incompletion for the sake of political necessity. It was the most reasonable thing he could ask, the only responsible choice given the circumstances, and Elara found herself refusing. "No." The word emerged with surprising strength. "I did not carry you 18 miles to watch you destroy yourself for politics. I did not save your life so you could throw it away on a marriage that will leave you hollow." Kyle turned from the window, surprise evident on his face. "Elara, you do not understand what you are saying. Without Sarah's alliance, we face war we cannot win. Thousands will die. The territories will fall to Northern Coalition control. This is not about personal happiness. This is about the survival of everyone who depends on my leadership. Then we find another way." Alara stood, moving toward him with determination that surprised them both. You taught me that strength comes in many forms, that endurance matters as much as power, that the weakest can accomplish the impossible when they refuse to accept limitations. Now I am teaching you the same lesson. She placed her hand on his chest, feeling his heart pounding beneath her palm. You said your wolf has returned because of our bond, that you are whole again for the first time in 2 years. A whole king is stronger than a broken one, even if the broken one has more soldiers. A king who leads from completeness rather than guilt will find solutions that a king drowning in self-punishment cannot see. Kael covered her hand with his, holding it against his heart. What solutions? The numbers are clear. We need Sarah's troops or we lose. Then we find a way to win without them. Alara spoke with confidence she did not entirely feel, but sometimes confidence was its own kind of magic. Your mentor Marcus taught you something important. He showed you that the chain of brotherhood extends beyond death, that soldiers fight harder for leaders they believe in than for leaders they fear. What if the solution is not more troops but more trust? She could see him processing her words, his tactical mind beginning to work through possibilities he had not considered because grief and guilt had blinded him to alternatives. The Northern Coalition is not a unified force, Alara continued, building on instinct and the observations she had made during their journey. They are 3 territories joined by mutual benefit. What if some of their soldiers do not want this war? What if veterans on both sides are tired of bleeding for leaders' ambitions? Kael's eyes widened as he grasped what she was suggesting. A peace movement, soldier to soldier, bypassing the political leadership who profit from conflict. Marcus's network, Alara said. All those veterans he trained over 40 years, they have counterparts in the Northern Coalition, men who fought together before politics divided them. What if we reached out? Not as king to subjects, but as soldiers to soldiers. It was audacious. It was probably impossible. But it was also exactly the kind of tactical thinking that came from seeing problems from angles others missed. Alara had spent her entire life being overlooked, which meant she had spent her entire life observing others without their notice. She understood how to find the cracks in seemingly solid walls. Kael pulled her into an embrace that conveyed relief and hope and something deeper than either. You see possibilities I have been too broken to imagine. This is why we are true mates. Not despite our differences, but because of them. My strength complements your insight. Your clarity cuts through my guilt. Together we are better than either of us could be alone. They stood together in the fading afternoon light, holding each other, and both felt their wolves settling into contentment. The bond between them was not complete yet, not formalized through the mating bite that would make it permanent. But it was real and growing stronger, and denying it would be denying themselves. That evening, Kael called an emergency meeting of his most trusted advisors. Not the full council with their political agendas and hidebound thinking, but the veterans who had served with Marcus, who understood warfare as something more than moving pieces on a map. Captain Dane was there, and General Raven Blackthorn, a woman in her mid-40s whose military brilliance was matched only by her absolute loyalty to the crown. Kael presented Alara's plan with the kind of conviction that made people listen. Reach out to Northern Coalition veterans through the networks Marcus had built over 4 decades. Soldier-to-soldier contact, bypassing the political leadership on both sides. Create a grassroots peace movement that made war impossible to prosecute because the soldiers themselves refused to fight. General Raven studied Alara with new interest. This is sophisticated strategic thinking. Where did you learn military tactics? I did not, Alara admitted. But I learned observation from being overlooked my entire life. And I learned that the people with the most power are not always the ones sitting on thrones. Sometimes power belongs to those who choose whether to follow orders. The general smiled, and it was the first genuinely warm expression Alara had received from anyone in the palace besides Kael. You are wasted as an advisor. You should be running intelligence operations. Over the next week, days 32 through 38, they put the plan into motion with military precision. Marcus's veterans reached out through channels that had existed long before political boundaries divided them. Letters were carried by trusted messengers. Meetings were arranged in neutral territories. The message was simple and powerful. We have bled enough for leaders' ambitions. We choose peace. But on day 39, disaster struck. Northern Coalition forces, detecting the peace movement among their own soldiers, launched a preemptive strike designed to crush dissent and force commitment through action. They attacked a border village, not to conquer, but to provoke, to force Crimson Ridge into retaliation that would make peace impossible. And in that attack, they specifically targeted Omega settlements. The message was clear. This is what happens to those who elevate weakness above strength. This is the price of defying natural hierarchy. Alara received word that Thornvale had been attacked. Her village, the people she had grown up healing, Miriam, who had taught her everything about medicine and perseverance. They were not military targets. They were symbols chosen specifically to hurt her and through her to hurt Kael. The council erupted in demands for immediate retaliation. "See," they said, "this is what your Omega counselor has brought us. War we could have prevented through proper marriage alliance. Now we must fight without Sarah's troops, because you chose sentiment over strategy." Kael stood before them, his face a mask of controlled fury, and delivered a response none of them expected. "You want strength? I will show you what strength looks like when it is not constrained by your political games." He turned to General Raven. "Mobilize our forces, but we do not march to war. We march to rescue. Every Omega settlement within 50 miles of our border will be evacuated to safety. We will not allow Northern Coalition to use the weakest among us as targets to force our hand." To Captain Dane, he gave different orders. "Continue reaching out to Northern Coalition veterans. Tell them what their leadership has done. Tell them that while their commanders target civilians, we are protecting them. Let them see the difference between leadership that uses people and leadership that serves them." And to Alara he said something that made her heart clench with fear and pride in equal measure. "I need you to go to Thornvale, to lead the evacuation personally. The people there trust you. They will follow you when they would not follow my soldiers. And the world needs to see that I value you enough to send you into danger, that your voice matters as much as any general's." It was brilliant strategy wrapped in profound risk. If Alara successfully evacuated Thornvale and the other Omega settlements, it would demonstrate that Kael's leadership style produced results that traditional approaches could not match. If she failed, it would prove the council right and doom both her position and their bond. Alara left for Thornvale the next morning, day 40, with a military escort and authority that should never have belonged to a weak Omega from a forgotten village. She carried written orders from the king himself, granting her command over evacuation operations. The soldiers assigned to protect her were veterans from Marcus's network, men who understood that strength came in many forms. The journey took 2 days, and Alara spent every hour planning how to convince people to leave the only homes they had ever known. Thornvale's residents were stubborn by necessity. They had survived at the margins because they refused to quit when quitting would have been rational. Convincing them to evacuate would require more than royal orders. It would require trust. She arrived on day 42 to find the village preparing to defend itself with farming tools and desperation. Northern Coalition forces had not attacked yet, but scouts had been spotted in the surrounding forests. Everyone knew an assault was coming. They simply did not know when. Miriam met her at the village edge, and the old healer's face showed relief and fear in equal measure. "You came back." "I came to take you somewhere safe." Alara embraced her mentor, feeling how frail the older woman had become in the weeks since they had last seen each other. "All of you. The king is evacuating every Omega settlement within reach of Northern Coalition forces." "And then what?" Miriam pulled back, searching Alara's face. "We abandon our homes and live where? As refugees dependent on royal charity, these people would rather die than beg. Then they will not beg. Elara spoke loudly enough for the gathering crowd to hear. They will relocate temporarily while the king's forces secure the border. And when it is safe to return, they will come back to villages that have been fortified and protected. This is not abandonment. This is strategic withdrawal, followed by reinforced return. An old farmer, a man who had lived in Thornvale for 70 years, spat on the ground in disgust. Fancy words from someone who ran off to the palace and forgot where she came from. The accusation stung because it held truth. Elara had left Thornvale for the capital, had spent her time in luxury while her people struggled. But she had not forgotten. She had never forgotten. You are right. She met the old farmer's eyes directly. I left. I saw the king's palace with its fine furniture and glass windows. I ate food that cost more than a year of Thornvale's harvests. And every single day I thought about home, about people who taught me that value is not measured in strength, but in showing up when everyone else walks away. She gestured to the soldiers standing respectfully at the village edge. These men do not think you are weak. They think you are survivors, which is the strongest thing anyone can be. The king does not think you are worthless. He thinks you deserve protection, which is why he sent his personal guard and gave me authority over trained generals to make sure you stay safe. The farmer studied her for a long moment, and she saw the calculation in his eyes. He was evaluating not just her words, but her sincerity. Finally, he nodded. We leave together or not at all. Every family, every person. We do not abandon the ones too old or sick to travel. Every person, Elara agreed. We march together at the pace of the slowest among us. That is what family does. The evacuation began within the hour. 200 villagers, from infants to elders who could barely walk, formed a column that stretched along the road towards safety. The soldiers surrounded them, protecting flanks and rear, scouts ranging ahead to detect threats. It should have been a disaster. It should have moved too slowly to escape pursuing forces. But it worked because everyone helped everyone else. The strongest carried supplies, so the weakest could focus on walking. Young people supported elders. Families that normally competed for resources now shared everything. Thornvale had always survived through mutual dependence, and now that survival instinct applied to the journey itself. On the second day of evacuation, day 43, Northern Coalition forces appeared on the horizon. 100 soldiers, enough to slaughter unarmed villagers, but not enough to defeat a trained military escort. They had expected to find helpless targets. Instead, they found organized resistance. The coalition commander, a scarred veteran whose face suggested decades of hard service, rode forward under a parley flag. He was older than Elara expected, perhaps 55, with eyes that had seen too much death to find joy in causing more. You are leading them away. His tone suggested observation rather than accusation. I am, Elara confirmed, to safety, to protection, to lives that do not require them to die for politics they did not choose. The commander studied the column of villagers, watched them helping each other with the kind of cooperation that spoke of deep community bonds. Our orders are to destroy Omega settlements, to prove that elevating weakness leads to destruction. Your orders come from leaders who profit from conflict. Elara spoke carefully, aware that she was walking a knife's edge between peace and violence. But you are a soldier, not a murderer. There is a difference between following orders and creating atrocities. Something in the man's expression shifted. Weariness, perhaps, or recognition of a truth he had been avoiding. What would you have me do? Refuse my commanders and face execution for insubordination? I would have you choose what kind of man you want to be when this is over. Elara gestured to the villagers. These people have done nothing to you. They are not warriors. They are farmers and healers and stubborn survivors who will not bend even when bending would be easier. Killing them accomplishes nothing except proving that might makes right. And when this war ends, as all wars eventually end, you will have to live with what you did during it. The commander sat in silence for a long moment. Behind him, his soldiers waited for orders. Before him, the villagers watched with the resigned expressions of people who had lived their entire lives expecting the worst. Finally, the commander spoke, and his words changed everything. I fought alongside Marcus Thornfield 30 years ago, before politics divided us. He saved my life in a border skirmish that no one remembers, pulled me from a burning building when staying would have been suicide. He met Alara's eyes directly. I heard he died recently, in an ambush, protecting your king. He did, Alara confirmed, giving his life so others could escape. That was who he was, a man who believed the chain of brotherhood extended beyond boundaries and borders. The commander nodded slowly. Then I will honor his memory by refusing to break that chain. My soldiers and I will withdraw. We will report that the Omega settlements had already been evacuated when we arrived. Our commanders will call us failures, but Marcus would call us human. I prefer his judgment to theirs. He turned his horse, signaling his troops to fall back. But before leaving, he spoke one final time. Tell your king that not all Northern Coalition soldiers want this war. Tell him that veterans on both sides are tired of dying for leaders who profit from our blood. And tell him that Marcus Thornfield's legacy reaches farther than anyone imagined. The evacuation continued without opposition. Alara led her people to safety, to the fortified towns Kyle had prepared to receive refugees, and word of what had happened spread like wildfire through both armies. The Northern Coalition commander, who had refused to slaughter civilians, became a symbol of something larger. The possibility that soldiers could choose conscience over orders, that peace could be built from the bottom up rather than imposed from the top down. Within a week, days 44 through 50, the grassroots peace movement exploded across both sides of the border. Veterans refused to attack each other. Soldiers from opposing armies met in neutral territories to share stories and memories of comrades lost to conflicts that had accomplished nothing. Young warriors listened to old soldiers speak of the true cost of war, the scars that never healed and the ghosts that never left. Northern Coalition leadership tried to suppress the movement through threats and punishment. But punishing thousands of soldiers simultaneously proved impossible. Court-martials became recruitment tools for the peace movement. Every veteran arrested for refusing to fight became a martyr whose story inspired others to join the resistance. Kyle watched from Iron Spire as the situation evolved exactly as Alara had predicted. Not through military brilliance or political maneuvering, but through simple human decency spreading person to person until it reached critical mass. The war everyone had considered inevitable became impossible to prosecute because the soldiers themselves refused to participate. On day 53, Northern Coalition leadership sent formal peace proposals, not because they had experienced a change of heart, but because continuing to threaten war without armies willing to fight made them look weak and foolish. The negotiations were brief and pragmatic. Border adjustments that addressed legitimate grievances, trade agreements that benefited both sides, mutual defense pacts that transformed former enemies into reluctant allies. Nobody got everything they wanted, everyone got something they needed, and most importantly, nobody died for pride or politics. The council could not argue with success, though they tried. Lord Brennus insisted that luck, rather than strategy, had prevented war. Lady Sarah claimed that her threatened military alliance had forced Northern Coalition to negotiate. But the veterans knew the truth. Marcus Thornfield's legacy, combined with a weak Omega's insight, had accomplished what traditional approaches could not. On the evening peace was formally declared, day 55 since the ambush that had nearly killed them both. Kyle came to Alara's quarters with determination and hope warring in his golden eyes. He did not speak immediately. He simply took her hands in his and held them, gathering courage for what he needed to say. "You were right," he said finally, "about everything. Strength comes in forms the council cannot recognize. Solutions appear when we refuse to accept that problems are unsolvable, and you, Alara Nightingale, are the strongest person I have ever known." He knelt before her, echoing the gesture from weeks ago, but this time with different purpose. "I am asking you to complete our true mate bond. Not because duty requires it or politics demands it, but because I love you. Because you make me whole in ways I did not know I was broken. Because I want to spend whatever time I have building something with you that matters more than crowns or kingdoms." Alara felt tears on her face and did not bother to hide them. "I am still weak, still an Omega who can barely shift, still from a village so forgotten most maps do not include it. Completing this bond will give ammunition to everyone who wants to see you fail. Then they will watch us succeed despite their opposition." Kyle smiled, and it was the expression of a man who had found peace after years of war with himself. "Your weakness has accomplished what my strength could not. Your insight has solved problems my tactics could not crack. You are exactly who I need, exactly as you are, no changes required." She pulled him to his feet and into an embrace that felt like coming home. "Yes, to the bond, to you, to whatever future we can build together." The mating bite was exchanged that night. Supernatural ceremony, witnessed only by their wolves and the moon. The bond clicked into place like a key turning in a lock that had waited lifetimes to open. Alara felt Kyle's strength flowing into her, not changing her weakness, but complementing it. Kyle felt her clarity cutting through his guilt, not erasing his past, but freeing him from its chains. They were bonded. True mates, permanently joined in ways that transcended physical proximity or political circumstance. Neither would ever be alone again. Neither would have to carry their burdens without help. They were stronger together than apart, and that strength would sustain them through whatever came next. The wedding took place 3 weeks later, day 76 since the ambush, a ceremony that combined political necessity with genuine emotion. Alara wore simple white, refusing the elaborate gowns the palace tried to force on her. Kyle wore his crown, but removed it before taking her hands, making clear that he married her as a man rather than as a king. The vows they exchanged emphasized partnership over possession, mutual support over traditional hierarchy. Kyle promised to honor her insight and protect her voice. Alara promised to stand beside him in darkness and remind him of light when guilt threatened to swallow him whole. The gathered nobility watched with expressions ranging from approval to disgust. But even the council members who had opposed the match most vigorously could not deny the evidence before them. The king was whole again. His wolf spirit manifested with the strength of an alpha in his prime. His decision-making had produced peace, where traditional approaches guaranteed war. Whatever they thought about Omega Queens, results were impossible to argue against. After the ceremony, after the political reception and diplomatic requirements had been satisfied, Kyle and Alara stood together on a palace balcony, looking out over Ironspire as night fell and lights began appearing like stars descended to earth. "Do you regret it?" Kyle asked quietly. "Leaving Thornvale? Becoming queen? Taking on burdens that were never supposed to be yours?" Alara thought about her cottage with its leaking roof, about gathering herbs in dangerous places because no one else would, about treating injuries with inadequate supplies and watching people die from problems better resources could have solved. She thought about the life she had left behind, small and limited and safe in its insignificance. "I regret nothing," she said, and meant it completely. "Thornvale taught me that value is not measured by others' recognition. You taught me that strength comes in unexpected forms. Together we have proven that the impossible is merely difficult, and the difficult is achievable when people refuse to accept limitations." She leaned against him, feeling his arm come around her shoulders in the now familiar gesture of support and affection. "I was weak. I was overlooked. I was from nowhere. And I carried a king 18 miles and changed the course of a kingdom. That is not something to regret. That is something to build on." Kyle held her close, his queen and his mate, the Omega who had saved him in every way a person could be saved. Marcus would have been proud of both of us. He would have, Alara agreed. The chain he died protecting holds, and it is stronger than anyone imagined. They stood together as darkness deepened and the city settled into sleep below them. Two people who should never have met, whose bond should never have formed, whose love defied every rule their society held sacred. But they had found each other anyway, broken pieces fitting together to create something whole. The weak Omega and the broken king had become the wise queen and the healed sovereign. And in becoming, they had proven that transformation was possible when people refused to accept the limitations others imposed. The future stretched before them, uncertain and challenging and full of obstacles they would face together. But they had already accomplished the impossible. Everything else was merely difficult. And difficult, they had learned, was something that could be overcome through determination, insight, and the stubborn refusal to quit when quitting would be easier. They would endure. They would build. They would honor Marcus's legacy by extending the chain of brotherhood to include everyone, regardless of strength or status or birth. That was their promise to each other and to the realm they would protect together. That was enough.